The transport helicopter's rotors cut through the desert air with mechanical precision as Lieutenant Avery Cross adjusted her gear one final time. 26 years old, West Point graduate, and according to her personnel file, an exemplary officer with exceptional analytical capabilities. None of that seemed to matter now as she stared out at the barren landscape of the Korangal Valley, knowing she was heading into what amounted to professional exile. Echo Unit hadn't requested a female officer. They hadn't requested an intelligence specialist either. What they'd gotten was both, wrapped up in a 5-on-6 package with steel gray eyes and a reputation for asking too many questions back at Fort Bragg. The transfer orders had been brief. Reassignment to Forward Operating Base Sentinel. Administrative and logistical support. Translation: they needed someone to blame when things went wrong, and Avery's recent clash with her previous commanding officer over outdated threat assessment protocols had made her the perfect candidate. The pilot's voice crackled through her headset. 2 minutes out, Lieutenant. Hope you packed your sense of humor. Avery didn't respond. She'd learned months ago that engaging with casual sexism only made it worse. Instead, she checked her rifle one more time, a habit that had become as natural as breathing. The weapon was pristine, maintained with the kind of obsessive care that separated good soldiers from dead ones. Everything else about this assignment might be punishment, but she'd be damned if she'd let her standards slip. As the helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust and debris, Avery caught her first glimpse of Fob Sentinel. It was smaller than she'd expected, maybe 200 men scattered across a collection of prefab buildings and reinforced bunkers. The mountains loomed on all sides, their peaks sharp against the cloudless sky. Beautiful and deadly. Exactly. The kind of place where careers went to die. Captain Derek Rowan was waiting at the makeshift landing pad, his arms crossed and an unlit cigar clenched between his teeth. 38 years old, career infantry, and according to the brief, Avery. Had read during the flight, a man who'd been passed over for promotion twice. He looked her up and down with the kind of assessment usually reserved for livestock. "So you're Cross," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Heard they were sending us some kind of analyst. Didn't expect them to gift wrap it." The men behind him snickered. Avery kept her expression neutral. "Sir. Well, since you're here to sing songs about threat matrices and probability curves, I figure we might as well call you something appropriate." His grin was sharp as broken glass. "How about Bluebird? Got a nice ring to it, don't you think?" More laughter from the assembled soldiers. Avery recognized the dynamic immediately. This wasn't just about her gender or her specialization. This was about power, about establishing hierarchy, about putting the new arrival in their place before they could upset the delicate ecosystem of military masculinity that kept units like Echo functioning. "Understood, sir," she said. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that Avery had been preparing for this moment her entire career. Every dismissive comment, every closed door, every time she'd been told she was too intense or overthinking things, had been training for this exact scenario. She'd learned to watch, to listen, to catalog every detail while maintaining the perfect facade of compliance. That first night, while the rest of the unit gathered around a burn barrel, sharing stories and passing around lukewarm coffee, Avery unpacked her gear in methodical silence. Her cot had been placed in the far corner of the tent, away from the others, another small assertion of dominance disguised as practicality. She didn't complain. Privacy was a luxury in her line of work. As she cleaned her rifle, the familiar routine of disassembly and inspection, she let her mind wander over the details she'd already absorbed. The base layout was inefficient, with blind spots that could be exploited. The communication protocols were outdated, relying too heavily on predictable patterns, and most importantly, the men around her were operating under assumptions that hadn't been tested in years. Someone mentioned that her breathing sounded almost musical, like she was humming under her breath. She wasn't, but she didn't correct them. Let them think she was just another dreamy female officer who'd wandered into the wrong profession. The truth was far more dangerous. The next morning brought her first official assignment. Inventory management for the ammunition depot. Glorified. Counting, designed to keep her busy and out of the way. Captain Rowan delivered the orders with a smirk, clearly expecting frustration or protest. "Any questions, Bluebird?" "No, sir," Avery replied. "I'll get started right away." What he didn't realize was that ammunition inventories were intelligence gold mines. Every bullet, every shell, every piece of ordnance told a story about operational tempo, expected threats, and resource allocation. As she worked her way through the depot, her trained eye caught discrepancies that spoke to deeper issues. Missing items that should have been logged, unusual requisitions that didn't match the base's stated mission profile, and most interesting of all, communication equipment that had been moved recently but wasn't reflected in any of the paperwork she'd been given access to. By the end of her third day, Avery had constructed a mental map of FOB Sentinel that went far beyond the official schematics. She knew which guards were the most attentive, which patrol routes were actually followed versus officially reported, and which pieces of equipment were functioning versus merely present. She also knew that something was wrong with the intelligence. Picture the base was operating under. The locals in the nearby village had changed their patterns. Children who usually played near the perimeter fence were gone. Elders who regularly approached the gates requesting supplies had stopped coming. And twice she'd observed the same two men leading pack animals along a trail that provided perfect observation of the base's northern approach. None of this information appeared in the official intelligence summaries. More troubling, when she'd attempted to access the base's analytical databases to cross-reference her observations, she'd been told her clearance level was insufficient. "That's above your pay grade, Bluebird," the communications specialist had said with a patronizing smile. "Maybe stick to counting bullets." So she did, but counting bullets had taught her patience, and patience had taught her to see patterns that others missed. As she settled into her cot that night, listening to the familiar sounds of a military base winding down, Avery began to suspect that her punishment assignment might turn out to be something else entirely. The mountains were full of secrets, and she was very good at finding secrets. The fourth morning at FOB Sentinel brought an unusual quiet that made Avery's skin crawl. As she walked the perimeter during her morning routine, a habit that had raised eyebrows but no direct objections, she noticed the absence of normal sounds. No children's voices from the village below, no morning calls to prayer. Even the usual bleating of goats seemed muted. She made her way to the communications tent where Corporal James Bradley was monitoring the radio feeds. At 24, Bradley was competent but lazy, the kind of soldier who did exactly what was required and nothing more. He barely looked up when she entered. "Morning, Bluebird. Come to serenade the radios?" "Just checking the overnight logs," Avery said, keeping her voice casual. "Captain Rowan wants me to cross-reference communication traffic with supply delivery schedules." It was a lie, but delivered with enough bureaucratic blandness that Bradley didn't question it. He gestured toward a stack of papers on the makeshift desk. "Knock yourself out. Pretty quiet night." Avery began flipping through the logs, her trained eye immediately catching what Bradley had missed. Buried among the routine check-ins and status reports were 3 brief transmissions on an obscure frequency. Each lasted less than 10 seconds. Each followed a pattern that screamed coordination rather than coincidence. "These signals here," she said, pointing to the entries. "Did you run them through the analysis software?" Bradley shrugged. "Probably just atmospheric interference. Happens all the time in these mountains." "Did you run them through the software?" Avery repeated. "Look, Bluebird, I've been doing this job for 3 years. I know what interference looks like." His tone carried the weary condescension of someone explaining basic concepts to a child. "Maybe you should focus on whatever inventory project Rowan's got you working on." Avery nodded and left without another word, but she'd memorized the frequency and timing of each transmission. More importantly, she'd confirmed what she'd suspected. Echo Unit's intelligence gathering was operating on autopilot, missing details that could mean the difference between life and death. The rest of the morning was spent in the depot, ostensibly continuing her inventory work, but actually mapping the base's defensive capabilities. What she found was troubling. The northern approach, the same area where she'd observed the mysterious pack train, had the weakest coverage. The automated sensors were old and prone to false positives, leading to a pattern where alerts were routinely ignored. The guard rotation had a 15-minute gap every 6 hours when shifts changed. It was exactly the kind of vulnerability that a competent enemy would exploit. As lunchtime approached, Avery found herself in the mess tent, listening to the casual conversation of soldiers who'd never had to think about operational security. The talk was all about rotation schedules, mail from home, and complaints about the heat, but buried in the chatter was something more valuable, a clear picture of the unit's operational tempo and expectations. "Heard the brass is talking about pulling us out early," said Sergeant Mike Torres, a 10-year veteran with graying temples. "Supposedly the sector's stabilized enough that we're not needed." "About time," replied Private Danny Walsh, barely old enough to shave. "Been here 4 months and haven't seen so much as a suspicious shadow." Avery filed that information away. A unit expecting to rotate out was a unit that had relaxed its vigilance. Perfect conditions for an enemy who'd been watching, waiting, and planning. After lunch, she made her way to the motor pool, where she'd been assigned to help with routine maintenance. The work was mindless, checking fluid levels, replacing filters, updating service logs. But it gave her access to the base's mobility assets and, more importantly, to Staff Sergeant Kevin Murphy. Murphy was different from the others. 42 years old, 3 combat deployments, and a reputation for being able to smell trouble coming. He'd been polite but distant since her arrival, clearly withholding judgment until she proved herself one way or another. "You're the new intelligence officer," he said as she approached his workstation. It wasn't a question. "Logistics support," Avery corrected, "though I do have an intelligence background." Murphy grunted and continued working on a transmission. "Housing. Heard you've been asking questions about the communication logs. Just trying to understand the operational picture." "And what picture is that?" Avery hesitated. This was the moment of truth. She could continue playing the role of harmless bureaucrat, or she could trust her instincts about Murphy's character. The veteran's steady hands and alert eyes suggested someone who'd survived this long by paying attention to details others missed. "Something's changed in the last week," she said quietly. "Local patterns, communication intercepts, even the way the village looks from the perimeter. I think someone's been watching us." Murphy's hands stilled for a moment. Then he resumed his work, but his voice was thoughtful. "Rowan know about this?" "I tried to brief him yesterday. He suggested I focus on my assigned duties." "And what are your assigned duties telling you?" Avery met his eyes. "That this base is operating under assumptions that haven't been tested in months, that our intelligence gathering is inadequate, and that if someone wanted to hit us, they've had plenty of time to figure out how." Murphy set down his tools and leaned back against the workbench. "You know what your problem is, Cross?" "What's that, Sergeant?" "You're probably right. And around here, being right without being invited to be right is the fastest way to get yourself shipped out or assigned to permanent latrine duty. So, I should just shut up and count bullets?" "That's one option." Murphy's smile was grim. "The other is to be so right that even Rowan can't ignore you. But that's a dangerous game, especially for someone with your particular combination of qualifications." That evening, Avery sat in her corner of the tent, ostensibly reading a paperback novel but actually processing everything she'd learned. The intelligence picture was becoming clearer, and it wasn't encouraging. All the signs pointed to a well-planned operation in the final stages of preparation. The question was whether she could convince anyone to listen before it was too late. Outside, the mountains were dark and full of secrets. And somewhere in that darkness, Avery was certain, someone was watching them back. The tension had been building for 5 days when Captain Rowan finally snapped. It started with Avery's 3rd attempt to brief him on the communication anomalies. She'd been tracking. She'd compiled a comprehensive report, complete with frequency analysis and pattern recognition, but Rowan had barely glanced at it before dropping it in his wastebasket. "Bluebird, I'm going to say this once and only once," he said, leaning back in his chair with the kind of theatrical authority that masked deep insecurity. Your job is to count supplies and file reports. Your job is not to play intelligence analyst. Your job is not to second-guess operational decisions made by officers with actual combat experience. Is that clear? Sir, with respect, I have combat experience, 3 deployments, including desk jockey deployments, Rowan interrupted. Pushing papers in air-conditioned bunkers doesn't count as combat experience. What counts is leading men under fire, making life-and-death decisions, and taking responsibility when things go wrong, things you've never done and never will do. The words hit their mark, just as Rowan had intended. But instead of the shame or anger he'd expected, Avery felt something else entirely. A cold, crystalline clarity that settled over her like armor. She'd been here before, in different uniforms with different men, but always the same dynamic. Always the same dismissal. "Understood, sir," she said. "Good. Now I've got a special assignment for you. The latrines in Building C need a deep clean, and I want them spotless by 1800 hours. Think you can handle that without overanalyzing the toilet paper consumption patterns?" Laughter from the assembled NCOs. Avery picked up her cap and headed for the door, but as she left, she heard Rowan's voice follow her. "And Bluebird, next time you want to play intelligence officer, remember that your clearance level couldn't get you access to a McDonald's menu." The humiliation was complete and public. Avery walked across the compound with her head high, ignoring the whispers and pointed stares. She'd been broken down to the most basic level of military existence, a soldier assigned to clean toilets because she'd had the audacity to notice that people were about to die. But as she gathered her cleaning supplies and headed toward Building C, Avery began to smile. Not the defeated smile of someone accepting punishment, but the cold smile of someone who just realized that her opponents had made a critical error. They'd assumed she would be humiliated into silence. They'd assumed that public embarrassment would make her retreat. They were wrong. The latrines in Building C were adjacent to the base's main communication hub. As Avery scrubbed floors and cleaned fixtures, she had a perfect view of the antenna arrays and cable runs that connected FOB Sentinel to the outside world. More importantly, she had access to the building's electrical systems and through a maintenance panel she'd noticed. During her inventory work, the fiber optic cables that carried the base's data traffic. What Captain Rowan didn't know was that Avery's intelligence training had included a specialty in signals interception and analysis. What he also didn't know was that her security clearance, while not high enough for official briefings, was more than sufficient for the kind of technical surveillance that could reveal enemy communication patterns. As she worked, Avery began implementing what she thought of as the janitor's gambit. Hidden in plain sight, dismissed as harmless, she had access to virtually every corner of the base. No one paid attention to the woman cleaning bathrooms. No one monitored her movements or questioned her presence in sensitive areas. It was perfect. By 1700 hours, the latrines were immaculate. By 1800 hours, Avery had tapped into the base's main communication feed and begun her own intelligence-gathering operation. Using a small tablet computer and a collection of improvised cables, she created a monitoring station that could intercept and analyze radio traffic across multiple frequencies. What she found in the first hour of surveillance made her blood run cold. The enemy communications were sophisticated, coordinated, and far more extensive than anyone at FOB Sentinel had realized. They were using a combination of burst transmissions, frequency hopping, and relay stations positioned throughout the mountains. The attack wasn't coming. It was already in motion. Avery ran the numbers 3 times, checking and rechecking. Her analysis. The enemy had been conducting detailed surveillance of the base for at least 2 weeks. They knew the guard rotations, the patrol schedules, and the exact timing of supply deliveries. They'd identified the weak points in the perimeter defenses and planned their assault route to exploit the 15-minute gap in sensor coverage. Most terrifying of all, they'd timed their attack to coincide with the base's lowest readiness period. The shift change at 0530 hours, when half the defenders would be asleep and the other half would be focused on routine handover procedures. The assault was scheduled for tomorrow morning. Avery stared at her tablet screen, watching the enemy communications traffic spike as final preparations were made. She had maybe 8 hours to convince someone to listen to her, 8 hours to overcome the institutional sexism, professional jealousy, and command dysfunction that had led to this moment. 8 hours to save the lives of everyone at FOB Sentinel. She thought about going to Captain Rowan again, but dismissed the idea immediately. He'd already made his position clear, and his ego wouldn't allow him to admit that the toilet-cleaning intelligence officer had uncovered something his entire staff had missed. Staff Sergeant Murphy was a possibility, but he lacked the authority to initiate base-wide defensive measures. Same with Corporal Bradley, who'd already proven himself incapable of recognizing genuine threats. That left one option: Colonel Rebecca Darrow, the base commander who'd been conspicuously absent during Avery's first week at FOB Sentinel. According to the duty roster, Darrow was returning from a briefing at regional headquarters and would be back on base by 2200 hours. Avery began preparing her presentation. Not the kind of formal briefing she'd been trained to deliver, but something more personal and immediate. She compiled her evidence, organized her analysis, and prepared to make the case for her life, and the lives of everyone around her. Outside, the mountains were dark and silent, but Avery knew that silence was an illusion. In the darkness, an enemy force was moving into position for an attack that could destroy everything she'd sworn to. Defend. The question was whether anyone would listen to a woman whose call sign was supposed to be a punishment. Colonel Rebecca Darrow arrived at FOB Sentinel at 2147 hours, her helicopter touching down in a swirl of dust and rotor wash that scattered the soldiers gathered around the landing pad. At 45, she was lean and silver-haired, with the kind of quiet authority that came from 20 years of making life-and-death decisions. Unlike Captain Rowan, she didn't need to prove her competence through displays of dominance. Avery watched from the shadows near the communications building as Darrow strode toward the command bunker, her aides struggling to keep pace. This was her one chance. The only person on base with both the authority and the intellect to understand what she'd discovered. The problem was access. Darrow would be in briefings for the next hour, receiving updates from her staff and reviewing operational reports. By the time she was free, it might be too late to organize an effective defense. Avery made her decision. She would break protocol, risk her career, and force a confrontation that could end with a court-martial. But at least she'd know she'd tried. She made her way to the command bunker, her tablet computer hidden under a stack of maintenance reports. The guard at the entrance, Private Danny Walsh, the young soldier who'd been complaining about the quiet deployment, barely looked up as she approached. "Evening, Bluebird. Working late?" "Emergency repair request from Captain Rowan," Avery said, showing him the maintenance paperwork. "Something about the ventilation system in the briefing." "Room," Walsh nodded and waved her through. The lie was simple enough to be believable, and her reputation as the base's designated maintenance worker gave her access to areas that would normally be off-limits. Inside the bunker, Avery could hear voices from the main briefing room. Darrow's voice, calm and analytical, asking questions about supply deliveries and patrol schedules. Captain Rowan's voice, confident and dismissive, assuring her that the sector remained stable and secure. Avery positioned herself in the maintenance corridor that ran behind the briefing room, separated from the main space by a thin wall and a ventilation grate. She could hear every word of the conversation, and more importantly, she could monitor the enemy communications traffic that continued to spike on her tablet. "Threat assessment remains minimal," Rowan was saying. "Local population appears cooperative. No unusual activity in the sector, all patrols reporting normal conditions." "What about intelligence gathering?" Darrow asked. "Are we maintaining adequate surveillance of potential approach routes?" "Our communication monitoring is thorough and professional," Rowan replied. "We've seen no indication of organized enemy activity." Avery felt a surge of anger at the casual dismissal of the very real threat she'd identified. But anger wouldn't save lives. She needed to be smart, strategic, and undeniable. She activated her tablet's recording function and began documenting the enemy communications in real time. Burst transmissions, coordinate references, timing confirmations, all of it painting a picture of an imminent attack that would catch. FOB Sentinel completely unprepared. At 22:30 hours, the enemy traffic reached a crescendo. Final movement orders, weapon assignments, and assault timing. The attack would begin at 05:30 hours, exactly as she'd predicted. They had 6 hours. Avery made her way to the briefing room door and knocked firmly. The conversation inside stopped abruptly. "Enter," came Darrow's voice. Avery stepped into the room, her tablet in hand, and her expression carefully neutral. Captain Rowan's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, anger, and finally a kind of exhausted frustration. "What the hell are you doing here, Bluebird?" he demanded. "This is a classified briefing." "Colonel Darrow," Avery said, ignoring Rowan completely and focusing on the base commander, "I have urgent intelligence that requires immediate action." "Lieutenant Cross," Darrow said, consulting her personnel roster, "you're assigned to logistics support." "Yes, ma'am. But I'm also a qualified intelligence analyst, and I've been monitoring enemy communications for the past 6 hours. FOB Sentinel is going to be attacked at 05:30 hours this morning." The silence in the room was deafening. Rowan's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. "Colonel, this officer has been disciplined repeatedly for overstepping her authority and manufacturing threats that don't exist. I recommend—" "Show me," Darrow interrupted, her eyes fixed on Avery. Avery placed her tablet on the briefing table and began her presentation. Communication intercepts, pattern analysis, timing correlation, and tactical assessment. She spoke for 10 minutes, her voice calm and professional, laying out the evidence with the precision of a surgeon. When she finished, Darrow was quiet for a long moment. Then she turned to Rowan. "Captain, were you aware of this communication traffic?" "Colonel, I was briefed on some anomalous signals, but our analysis indicated they were most likely atmospheric interference or equipment malfunction. There was no credible evidence of—" "Did you run a full spectrum analysis?" Darrow asked. Our communication specialist determined that wasn't necessary." "I see." Darrow turned back to Avery. "Lieutenant, what's your assessment of enemy?" "Strength and capability. Based on the communication volume and coordination patterns, I estimate a reinforced squad, possibly with heavy weapons support. They've conducted detailed reconnaissance of our defensive positions and timed their assault to exploit our shift change vulnerabilities." "Recommendations?" "Immediate implementation of Condition Charlie defensive measures. Cancel the 05:30 shift. Change and maintain full manning on all positions. Deploy counter-sniper teams to overwatch positions on the northern ridge. And send immediate notification to Regional Command for quick reaction force support." Darrow was already reaching for her secure phone. "Captain Rowan, implement Lieutenant Cross's recommendations immediately. I want this base on full alert. In 15 minutes. "Colonel," Rowan said, his voice strained, "with respect, we're talking about disrupting operations based on the analysis of an officer who was assigned to latrine duty this afternoon. I think we should—" "Captain," Darrow said, her voice cutting through his objections like a blade, "Lieutenant Cross has just provided me with the most comprehensive threat analysis I've seen in 6 months. Her clearance level and assigned. Duties are irrelevant to the validity of her intelligence. Now, are you going to implement these defensive measures, or do I need to find someone who will?" Rowan's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Yes, ma'am." As he left to organize the base's defense, Darrow turned back to Avery. "Lieutenant, I want you in the command center for the duration of this alert. Your analysis may have just saved a lot of lives." "Thank you, ma'am." "Don't thank me yet. If you're wrong about this, your career is over. But if you're right—" Darrow smiled grimly. "If you're right, then a lot of people owe you an apology." Outside, the base was coming alive. With purposeful activity, soldiers ran to their defensive positions, heavy weapons were repositioned, and the quiet confidence of a routine deployment was replaced by the sharp alertness of impending combat. Avery took her position in the command center, her tablet connected to the base's communication system, monitoring the enemy traffic that continued to flow across the frequencies. The attack was still coming, but now FOB Sentinel would be ready. For the first time since arriving at the base, Avery allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. She'd broken through the barriers of sexism and institutional inertia. She'd forced them to listen. Now all she had to do was prove she was right. At 05:27 hours, 3 minutes before the predicted attack time, the first rocket-propelled grenade streaked across the pre-dawn darkness and exploded against the northern perimeter. "Wall?" The blast wave rolled across Fob Sentinel like thunder, shattering windows and setting off every alarm on the base. Avery was already at her position in the command center, headset on, watching the tactical display as enemy contacts began appearing. On the sensors, the attack was unfolding exactly as she'd predicted, a coordinated assault on the base's weakest point, timed to exploit what should have been a shift change vulnerability. But instead of sleepy, unprepared defenders, the attackers found alert soldiers in hardened positions. Instead of confused responses and disorganized resistance, they encountered coordinated fire from multiple directions. The ambush had become a trap. "Contact North Wall, multiple hostiles with RPGs," came the voice of Sergeant Torres over the radio. "Engaging now." "Sniper Team Alpha, I have eyes on muzzle flashes, grid 4721, reported Staff Sergeant Murphy from his overwatch position. "Taking the shot." Colonel Darrow stood at the center of the command bunker, calm and focused, orchestrating the defense with precision. But every few minutes her eyes would drift to Avery, who was providing real-time intelligence updates based on her continued monitoring of enemy communications. "Enemy command is requesting immediate withdrawal," Avery reported, her voice steady, despite the chaos around her. "They're realizing their surprise is blown." "Negative," came another voice from the radio. "Enemy reinforcements moving up the eastern approach. Estimated squad strength." "Bluebird," Darrow said, using Avery's call sign for the first time without mockery. "What's your read on their intentions?" Avery studied the communication intercepts flowing across her screen. "They're committed now, ma'am. The reinforcements are their reserve element. They're going to try to punch through our lines and cause maximum casualties before withdrawing." "Understood. All units prepare for second wave." The battle raged for another 40 minutes. The enemy force was professional and well-equipped, but they'd planned their assault based on intelligence that was now obsolete. Every movement they made was anticipated. Every attack met with coordinated resistance. At 06 to 18 hours, the enemy communications went silent. At EO6:25 hours, the last muzzle flash disappeared from the ridge lines. By EO6:30 hours, FOB Sentinel was secure. The casualty report was almost unbelievable. 3 wounded, none seriously. The enemy had lost at least 8 killed and an unknown number wounded. It was the kind of one-sided victory that military historians would study for decades. But in the immediate aftermath, as medics treated the wounded and soldiers began assessing the damage, a different kind of battle was beginning. Captain Rowan emerged from the command bunker, his face grim and his jaw set. He'd spent the entire firefight coordinating logistics while Colonel Darrow ran the tactical response, a humiliating reminder of his own irrelevance. "Lucky guess," he said as he passed Avery's position. "Even a broken clock is right twice a day." It was petty and vindictive, but it was also revealing. Rowan understood that his authority had been fundamentally undermined by the night's events. An officer he'd assigned to clean latrines had just demonstrated capabilities that made his entire leadership team look incompetent. Staff Sergeant Murphy overheard the comment and stepped forward. "With respect, sir, that wasn't luck. That was professional intelligence analysis that saved this base." "Sergeant Murphy," Rowan said, his voice carrying a warning, "I'd be careful about Monday morning quarterbacking. We don't know what would have happened if we'd maintained normal operations." "We know exactly what would have happened," Murphy replied. "We'd have been overrun and killed, every one of us." The confrontation might have escalated, but Colonel Darrow's voice cut through the tension. "Captain Rowan, report to my office immediately. I want a full after-action briefing on how this threat was initially assessed and handled." As Rowan stalked away, Darrow turned to Avery. "Lieutenant, I need a complete intelligence report on tonight's action. Include your methodology, your analysis, and your recommendations for improving our threat detection capabilities." "Yes, ma'am. And Lieutenant, that report will be going directly to Division Command, along with my personal assessment of your performance." Over the next few hours, as the base returned to normal operations, word of the attack began to spread through unofficial channels. Soldiers who'd been in the fight started talking to friends at other bases. Medics uploaded casualty reports that showed minimal friendly losses against a determined enemy assault. Communication specialists noted the precision of the intelligence that had predicted the attack, The story that emerged was simple and compelling. A female intelligence officer assigned to menial duties and dismissed by her commanding officer had single-handedly identified and thwarted a major enemy attack. Her call sign, intended as mockery, had become a symbol of competence and courage. By midday, the story had reached the ears of a defense correspondent who'd been covering the Afghan conflict for 5 years. By evening, it was being discussed in Pentagon briefing rooms. By the next morning, it was the lead story on every military blog and forum. Captain Rowan's version of events, that the attack had been anticipated through normal intelligence channels and defeated through standard defensive measures, was quickly overwhelmed by first-hand accounts from the soldiers who'd been there. The truth was too compelling and too well documented to suppress. More damaging for Rowan was the inevitable investigation that followed. Division Command wanted to understand how such a significant threat had been missed by the base's intelligence apparatus. They wanted to know why a logistics officer had been more effective at threat detection than the entire Echo unit staff. The answers weren't flattering. Radio logs showed that Avery had attempted to brief her superiors multiple times, only to be dismissed and assigned to menial duties. Personnel records revealed a pattern of competent female officers being marginalized and underutilized. Communication protocols showed systematic gaps in threat assessment and analysis. Most damaging of all was the revelation that Captain Rowan had been aware of the anomalous communications, but had chosen to ignore them based on his personal assessment of the analyst who'd identified them. The investigation report was classified, but its conclusions were clear. FOB Sentinel had come within hours of a catastrophic defeat due to command failure and institutional prejudice. Only the initiative and competence of a single junior officer had prevented a disaster. Colonel Darrow was promoted and transferred to a training command, where she implemented new protocols for intelligence analysis and threat assessment. Her recommendation for Avery was brief but devastating in its implications. Lieutenant Cross represents the future of military intelligence. Her analysis was flawless, her courage was exemplary, and her treatment by subordinate officers was inexcusable. Captain Rowan was relieved of command and reassigned to a desk job at Fort Benning. His efficiency report contained a single line that would haunt him for the rest of his career: failed to recognize and utilize available intelligence assets, resulting in near-catastrophic operational failure. But the real victory wasn't in the official reports or personnel actions. It was in the moment, 3 days after the attack, when Staff Sergeant Murphy approached Avery's desk in the command center, her new permanent assignment, and said quietly, "No one's going to call you Bluebird as a joke anymore." Avery looked up from her intelligence analysis, her eyes calm and professional. "Good," she said, "because I was never the one who needed to be laughed at." 2 weeks after the attack, the official inquiry arrived at FOB Sentinel in the form of Colonel Patricia Barnes, a stern-faced woman from the Inspector General's office who'd spent 15 years investigating military failures. She brought with her a team of analysts, a stack of classified documents, and the kind of methodical approach that made careers disappear overnight. The formal hearing was scheduled for 1400 hours in the base's main conference room. Present would be Colonel Darrow, Captain Rowan, Lieutenant Cross, and selected personnel who'd been involved in the events leading up to the attack. What should have been a routine after-action review had become something much more significant, a reckoning with the systemic failures that had nearly led to disaster. Avery arrived 15 minutes early, her dress uniform immaculate and her bearing confident. She'd spent the past 2 weeks documenting every detail of her experience at FOB Sentinel, from her initial intelligence assessments to the moment she'd forced her way into Colonel Darrow's briefing. The evidence was overwhelming, but she knew that evidence alone wouldn't be enough. She needed to be perfect. Captain Rowan entered the room at exactly 1400 hours, his own uniform regulation perfect, but his face showing the strain of 2 weeks. Under investigation, he'd spent those weeks crafting his defense, blaming communication failures and intelligence gaps, while carefully avoiding any admission of personal responsibility. His strategy was simple: claim that the threat assessment process had followed established protocols and that any failures were systemic rather than individual. It might have worked if not for the woman sitting across the table from him. "Colonel," Barnes called the hearing to order with bureaucratic precision. "This inquiry is being conducted to determine the facts surrounding the enemy attack on a FOB Sentinel on March 15th, and to assess whether proper procedures were followed in the threat assessment and defensive preparation phases. Lieutenant Cross, you may begin your statement. Avery stood and activated a laptop computer connected to the room's projection system. On the screen appeared a timeline, meticulously documented and cross-referenced with official logs and radio transcripts. Ma'am, I'd like to walk through the sequence of events that led to the identification and prevention of this attack, beginning with my arrival at Fabi Sentinel on March 8th. For the next 40 minutes, Avery presented her case with surgical precision. She showed how she'd identified anomalous communication patterns within hours of her arrival. She documented her attempts to brief Captain Rowan and his staff on potential threats. She presented radio intercepts, timing analysis, and tactical assessments that painted a picture of professional competence repeatedly dismissed and ignored. Most damaging was her documentation of the disciplinary actions taken against her for performing her job. The assignment to latrine duty, the restrictions on her access to intelligence databases, the public humiliation designed to silence her concerns. Captain Rowan, Colonel Barnes said when Avery had finished, please respond to Lieutenant Cross's allegations. Rowan stood, his jaw tight and his voice carefully controlled. Ma'am, Lieutenant Cross was assigned to logistics duties because that's where we needed personnel support. Her attempts to involve herself in intelligence analysis were outside her assigned responsibilities and potentially disruptive to established procedures. Did you review her intelligence assessments? I was briefed on some anomalous communications, yes, but our evaluation indicated they were most likely equipment malfunction or atmospheric interference. Who conducted that evaluation? Corporal Bradley, our communications specialist. Did Corporal Bradley have access to the same analytical tools and databases that Lieutenant Cross was requesting? Rowan hesitated. Our resources are limited in a forward deployment environment. That's not what I asked, Captain. Did Corporal Bradley have access to the same analytical capabilities? No, ma'am. So you assigned the analysis of potential threats to someone with inferior capabilities rather than allowing a qualified intelligence officer to perform the assessment using appropriate tools? Ma'am, Lieutenant Cross's clearance level is top secret with SCI access, Colonel Barnes interrupted, consulting her files. Her analytical training includes advanced signals intelligence and threat assessment. Her previous performance evaluations describe her as exceptional and one of the most capable analysts in her career field. Are you telling me that Corporal Bradley, with a secret clearance and basic communication training, was better qualified to assess sophisticated enemy communications? The silence in the room was absolute. Rowan's carefully constructed defense was crumbling in real time, exposed as the product of prejudice rather than professional judgment. Captain Rowan, Barnes continued, can you explain why Lieutenant Cross was assigned to latrine duty on the same day she submitted a formal threat assessment? That was a routine duty assignment. A routine assignment of a West Point graduate and intelligence specialist to clean toilets immediately after she'd identified a potential security threat? Ma'am, all officers are expected to. Captain, I've reviewed the duty rosters for the past 6 months. Lieutenant Cross was the only officer assigned to latrine duty during that entire period. In fact, she was the only officer assigned to latrine duty in the entire history of FOB Sentinel's operations. Can you explain why? Rowan's face had gone pale. He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. I felt that Lieutenant Cross needed to understand the full scope of military responsibilities before taking on more specialized duties. By cleaning toilets? Yes, ma'am. Colonel Barnes made a note in her file, then looked up at Rowan with an expression that could have frozen blood. Captain, in your professional opinion, did Lieutenant Cross's intelligence analysis prove accurate? Yes, ma'am. Did her threat assessment save lives? Yes, ma'am. Did her tactical recommendations prove effective? Yes, ma'am. And yet you assigned this officer, whose analysis was flawless and whose recommendations were proven correct, to clean latrines because you felt she needed to understand military responsibilities? Rowan said nothing. There was nothing he could say. Colonel Barnes turned to Avery. Lieutenant Cross, do you have anything to add? Avery stood again, her voice calm and professional. Ma'am, I don't want this to be about personal grievances or individual failings. What matters is that we fix the systemic issues that led to this situation. Female officers and specialists from non-traditional backgrounds bring valuable perspectives to military operations. But only if we create environments where those perspectives can be heard and acted upon. She paused, looking directly at Rowan. Captain Rowan made decisions based on assumptions about my capabilities rather than evidence of my performance. Those decisions nearly cost lives. I respectfully suggest that the real issue isn't what happened to me, but what might happen to the next female officer who tries to do her job in an environment that doesn't value her contributions. Barnes nodded slowly. Thank you, Lieutenant. This hearing is concluded. All parties will receive notification of findings and recommendations within 72 hours. As the room cleared, Captain Rowan approached Avery's position. His face was grim, but his voice was quiet and controlled. You know this will follow me for the rest of my career, he said. Avery looked at him steadily. So will the knowledge that you nearly got your entire unit killed because you couldn't handle taking advice from a woman. That's not... Captain, Avery interrupted. We both know exactly what this was about. The question is whether you're going to learn from it or spend the rest of your career making the same mistakes. Rowan stared at her for a long moment, then turned and walked away, without another word. 3 days later, the inquiry results were released. Captain Rowan was relieved of command and reassigned to a staff position. Corporal Bradley was transferred to a communications unit where his limitations would be less dangerous. And Lieutenant Avery Cross was promoted to captain and assigned as the new intelligence officer for the entire regional command. But the real victory came in the recommendation that accompanied the personnel actions. The events at FOB Sentinel demonstrate the critical importance of utilizing all available analytical capabilities, regardless of gender, rank, or traditional role assignments. Military effectiveness depends on our ability to recognize and employ talent wherever it exists. It was a small paragraph in a classified report, but it represented a fundamental shift in thinking that would influence military operations for years to come. Captain Avery Cross's promotion ceremony took place on a crisp morning in April, 6 weeks after the attack that had changed everything. The base had been transformed in the interim. New communication equipment, upgraded defensive positions, and most importantly, a completely restructured intelligence operation that prioritized capability over convention. Colonel Darrow performed the promotion herself, pinning the captain's bars on Avery's uniform while the assembled soldiers of FOB Sentinel watched in respectful silence. These were the same men who'd laughed at her call sign just 2 months earlier. Now they stood at attention, recognizing not just her promotion but the fundamental shift in their understanding of what leadership looked like. Ladies and gentlemen, Darrow said, her voice carrying across the formation, Captain Cross represents the future of military intelligence. Her analysis, courage, and professionalism under difficult circumstances exemplify the highest traditions of the United States Army. The applause was genuine and sustained, but Avery noticed something else in the faces around her, a kind of watchful respect that suggested her real work was just beginning. Proving herself once had been difficult. Proving herself every day would be the real challenge. After the ceremony, Staff Sergeant Murphy approached her with a small, wrapped package. "Thought you might want this," he said with a slight smile. Inside was a patch, custom-made, featuring a bluebird in flight with the words, "Bluebird, Protocol Not Punishment," embroidered beneath it. It was simple, dignified, and powerful. "The guys took up a collection," Murphy explained. "Figured you'd earned the right to wear that name with pride." Avery studied the patch for a moment, then looked up at Murphy. "You know what this means, don't you? Every time I wear this, I'm reminding people that change is possible, that assumptions can be wrong, that talent exists in places they might not expect to find it." "Good," Murphy said. "Maybe that's exactly what we need to be reminded of." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of new responsibilities and challenges. As the regional intelligence officer, Avery was responsible for threat assessment across 12 forward operating bases. Her analysis methods, refined during her time at FOB Sentinel, were implemented throughout the command structure. The Bluebird Protocol became shorthand for comprehensive multi-source intelligence gathering that prioritized accuracy over convenience. But the real change was subtler and more profound. Female officers throughout the region began reporting improved working conditions and increased responsibilities. Specialists from non-traditional backgrounds found their expertise valued rather than dismissed. The military's institutional culture, resistant to change for decades, began to shift in small but significant ways. The transformation wasn't without resistance. There were still officers who resented the new emphasis on capability over tradition. There were still incidents of discrimination and prejudice, but now there was also a framework for addressing those issues and a clear example of what could be accomplished when talent was recognized and utilized effectively. 6 months after her promotion, Avery received a letter from a young lieutenant at Fort Bragg. The woman described facing similar challenges to those Avery had encountered: dismissive superiors, limited opportunities, assignment to duties below her qualifications. But she also described something new: hope. The story of Bluebird had given her the courage to persevere and the confidence to speak up when she identified important intelligence. "Your example showed me that sometimes the system doesn't recognize value," the lieutenant wrote. "But that doesn't mean the value isn't there. It just means we have to be twice as good and 3 times as persistent." Avery kept that letter in her desk drawer, along with dozens of others that arrived over the following months. Each one represented someone who'd found the courage to push back against institutional barriers. Each one represented progress. The media attention eventually faded, as it always does. The official reports were classified and filed away, but the impact continued to ripple outward through personal connections, training programs, and policy changes that gradually transformed how the military identified and developed talent. A year later, Avery was invited to speak at the Army War College on the subject of adaptive intelligence gathering. As she stood before an audience of senior officers and future commanders, she thought about how far she'd traveled from that first day at FOB Sentinel. "The most dangerous enemy isn't the one you can see," she told the assembled officers. "It's the one you've trained yourself not to notice. Whether that's a threat in the field or talent in your own ranks, the principle is the same. Success depends on your ability to see clearly and act decisively, even when that action challenges your assumptions." After her presentation, a colonel approached her with a question. "Captain Cross, what would you say to young officers who feel their contributions aren't being recognized?" Avery considered the question carefully. "I'd tell them that recognition isn't the goal. Effectiveness is. Do the work, develop your skills, and be ready when the moment comes, because eventually, competence becomes impossible to ignore. And if that moment never comes, then you create it, just like I did." 2 years after the attack on FOB Sentinel, Major Avery Cross stood in the Pentagon briefing room addressing a joint session of military leadership on the implementation of new intelligence protocols. The Bluebird Standard had become doctrine, adopted by every branch of the military and credited with preventing dozens of attacks across multiple theaters of operation. But as she presented her findings to the assembled generals and admirals, Avery knew that the real victory wasn't in the policies or procedures. It was in the emails she continued to receive from young officers who'd found their voices, the reports of improved performance in units that had embraced diverse perspectives, and the gradual but unmistakable shift in military culture that valued capability over convention. The presentation concluded with a video message from Colonel Darrow, now commanding a training brigade at Fort Leavenworth. "The events at FOB Sentinel taught us that excellence can emerge from unexpected places," she said. "Our job as leaders is to create environments where that excellence can flourish, regardless of gender, background, or traditional expectations." As the session ended and the senior officers filed out, General Marcus Webb, the Army Chief of Staff, approached Avery with a folder marked "Top Secret, Eyes Only." "Major Cross," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of command experience, "I have an offer for you. We're creating a new position, Director of Adaptive Intelligence Operations. The job would involve developing and implementing innovative analysis methods across all military branches. Interested?" Avery opened the folder and scanned the job description. It was everything she'd worked toward: the opportunity to institutionalize the changes she'd fought for, to ensure that what had happened to her would never happen to anyone else. "Sir," she said, "I accept." 6 months later, the Adaptive Intelligence Operations Center was operational, housed in a state-of-the-art facility at Fort Belvoir. The center brought together the military's most innovative analysts, regardless of rank, gender, or traditional career paths. Their mission was simple: identify threats and opportunities that conventional analysis might miss. On the wall of Avery's office hung 2 items: her original assignment orders to FOB Sentinel and the patch that Staff Sergeant Murphy had given her after her promotion. The contrast between them told the entire story of her journey from punishment assignment to institutional leadership, but the real measure of her success wasn't found in awards or promotions. It was in the steady stream of young officers who sought her mentorship, the increasingly diverse composition of military intelligence units, and the documented improvement in threat detection capabilities across all operational theaters. During a staff meeting that fall, one of her analysts, a young woman who'd faced similar challenges to those Avery had encountered, approached her with a question. "Ma'am," she said, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't spoken up that night at FOB Sentinel?" Avery considered the question for a moment. "I think about it sometimes," she said, "but the truth is someone would have spoken up eventually. Maybe not that night, maybe not in time to prevent casualties, but eventually. The important thing isn't whether I was the one who did it. It's that we created a system where the next person won't have to fight as hard to be heard." The young officer nodded thoughtfully. "So it wasn't really about you at all?" "No," Avery said with a slight smile. "It was about all of us. I was just the one who happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right skills and the wrong call sign." As evening fell over the facility, Avery walked through the operational floors, observing the diverse team of analysts working on threats from around the globe. The work continued, as it always had, but now it was informed by a broader range of perspectives and a deeper understanding of where excellence could be found. In the Secure Communication Center, she paused at a workstation where the duty officer was monitoring transmissions from a forward operating base in Syria. The analyst, a sergeant with an unusual background in linguistics, had identified a pattern in enemy communications that suggested an imminent attack. "Good work," Avery said, reviewing the analysis. "Have you briefed the base commander?" "Yes, ma'am. Defensive measures are being implemented now." It was a routine exchange, the kind that happened hundreds of times each day in military installations around the world, but to Avery it represented something profound, a system that now listened to voices that might once have been ignored, that valued insight over hierarchy, and that measured success by results rather than convention. Late that night, as she prepared to leave the office, Avery received an encrypted message from an unknown sender. It was brief, just a few lines. "Major Cross, you don't know me, but I'm a lieutenant at an FOB in Afghanistan. My CO tried to silence me when I identified a threat pattern, but I remembered your story. I pushed back, insisted on a hearing, and we prevented an attack yesterday. Thank you for showing us that our voices matter." "Bluebird 2, Avery smiled and forwarded the message to her secure archive, where it joined hundreds of similar communications. Each one represented a victory not just for the individual who'd sent it, but for a military culture that was slowly learning to recognize excellence wherever it emerged. The transformation that had begun with a punishment call sign in a remote valley had rippled outward, changing lives and saving lives in ways that would never be fully quantified. But perhaps that was fitting. The most important changes often happened quietly, one voice at a time, one decision at a time, one moment of courage at a time. Outside her window, the lights of Washington glittered in the darkness, and somewhere in the world young officers were learning that their insights mattered, their voices had value, and their determination could change everything. The call sign. Bluebird had begun as mockery. It had become a symbol of transformation, and that transformation was just beginning. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.